In the shimmering heat of a Memphis afternoon in 1975, Elvis Presley bought 14 Cadillacs in 90 minutes. He didn't need them. He didn't even want them. He gave them all away on the spot, to friends, to staff, and to one woman he'd never met before, a bank teller who just happened to be admiring a golden white Eldorado through the showroom window. It was a gesture of mythic proportions, the act of a modern-day king showering his subjects with treasure. But what if every gleaming fender, every sparkling diamond, wasn't a gift, but a payment? A desperate ransom paid to keep the ghosts of his own past locked away? This is the story of a man who could give the world anything it asked for, except for the one thing he desperately needed to give himself: peace. It is the story of a generosity so immense, so pathological, it became a prison of his own making. The gold-plated bars were invisible, but they were there all the same, forged in the fires of a poverty so deep it had scarred his soul. To understand the king, you must first understand the boy. Before the roar of the crowd, there was the silence of lack. Before the silk shirts, there was the rough-hewn cotton of charity. He was born in 1935 in a house his father, Vernon, built with his own hands for a loan of $180. It was a shelter, not a home, a fragile wooden box standing against the crushing weight of the Great Depression. He was a twin, Jesse Garon Presley, stillborn 35 minutes before Elvis Aaron drew his first breath. From his first moment in the world, Elvis was defined by an absence, a void beside him. He would carry the ghost of that lost brother forever, a primal fear of being alone that would echo through every gilded room he would ever inhabit. That fear, it had a texture. It felt like the cold wooden floorboards of the shack on a winter morning. It sounded like the whispers of his parents, worrying over bills they could not pay. It was a poverty that didn't just empty the stomach. It hollowed out a man's pride. Young Elvis saw the shame in his father's eyes, the perpetual exhaustion in his mother's hands. He felt the sting of being the poor kid, the one who lived on the wrong side of the tracks in a town that had plenty of them. He swore an oath to himself, a silent, desperate promise whispered into the Mississippi darkness. He would never be hungry again. He would never be helpless again. He would build a fortress around his mother, a castle to protect her from the world that had been so cruel, and he would pay for it all in cash. This is the 3-minute mark, a turning point. The viewer now understands the source of the wound. Now, we rehook them by connecting that wound directly to the legend. The first payment on that childhood debt was made in 1955. It wasn't a house. Not yet. It was something more symbolic. A chariot. A 1955 Cadillac Fleetwood Series 60 Special, painted in a custom shade he called Elvis Rose. It was for Gladys, the woman who had scrubbed floors and picked cotton, who had worried herself sick over every dime. He drove it to their rented Memphis apartment and watched her face, searching for a reflection of his own triumph. He wasn't just giving his mother a car. He was trying to give her a new past. He was attempting to physically erase the years of walking, of wanting, of doing without. Every mile that car drove was a mile further from Tupelo. Every admiring glance it received was a balm on the old wounds of shame. It was a beautiful gesture, a loving son's tribute. It was also the first brick in the wall of his prison, because the relief it brought was fleeting. The high of the grand gesture faded, but the ghost of poverty remained. The fear was a persistent phantom, and it could only be held at bay by constant, escalating acts of financial exorcism. One Cadillac was not enough. The fortress around his heart needed higher walls, more guards, a bigger moat, so he bought more cars. He bought houses. He bought rings with diamonds so large they looked like frozen tears. He began to surround himself with an entourage, a brotherhood of friends and cousins from back home. They became known as the Memphis Mafia. On the surface, it was the dream. A king and his loyal court, living in a state of perpetual boyhood, insulated from the mundane world by a wall of money and fame. He paid for their clothes, their food, their homes, their families. He gave them jobs that were ill-defined, demanding only one thing in return: presence. He was buying companionship. He was paying salaries for friendship, putting loyalty on a retainer. It was a desperate, unconscious strategy to fill the void left by Jesse Garon, to populate the terrifying silence of being alone at the top. He loved these men, there was no doubt, but the love was complicated, tangled up in a web of financial dependency that he himself had woven. Could a man whose approval came with a paycheck ever tell you the truth? Could a friend whose mortgage you paid ever truly say no? He had recreated the power dynamic of his childhood, but this time, he was the one in control. He was no longer the helpless boy. He was the benefactor, the provider, the king. It was a position of absolute power, and absolute isolation. This is the 6-minute mark. The audience now sees the dynamic of the Memphis Mafia. The next rehook will introduce a crack in this carefully constructed reality. The transactions were usually unspoken, a seamless flow of cash and gifts that lubricated the machinery of his life. But sometimes, the gears would grind. Sometimes, the quiet part would be said out loud, and the illusion of a carefree brotherhood would shatter for a moment, revealing the stark, cold framework beneath. One evening, a member of his circle, a man he considered a brother, came to him with a problem. He was in debt, a significant amount. Elvis listened, his face a mask of concern, and without a moment's hesitation, he had the money brought to him. A briefcase full of cash. He handed it over. The problem was solved. But the air in the room had changed. The act, meant to be one of loving support between friends, had become something else. A transaction. The man was grateful, but in his eyes, there was a flicker of something else. Resentment, humiliation. The invisible line between friend and employee had been drawn in glowing, undeniable ink. Elvis saw it. For a split second, the king was gone, and in his place was the small, shamed boy from Tupelo, standing on the other side of a transaction, feeling the sting of charity. The gift had not brought them closer. It had pushed them apart. It had reinforced the very power imbalance he was so desperate to escape. He never spoke of it. He just started giving more. The generosity became a fever. It was a compulsion, an addiction as powerful as any of the pills that would later line his medicine cabinet. The joy was no longer in the giving itself, but in the momentary relief it provided from the gnawing anxiety within. Each gift was a shield, deflecting his own fear of worthlessness back at the world. "Look how much I can give," the gesture screamed. "Look how much I have. I am not that poor boy anymore. I am not helpless." But the house heard his secrets. Graceland, the ultimate gift he had bought for his mother, the fortress against the world, became his gilded cage. It was a palace built on fear, its foundations mortared with a desperate need for love and a profound misunderstanding of how to get it. He filled its rooms with people, with noise, with constant activity, anything to drown out the silence, anything to avoid being alone with his thoughts. This is the 9-minute mark. The stakes are personal now, centered on the psychological prison of Graceland. The next rehook needs to show the external consequences of this internal war. And there were always people willing to take, people who saw his compulsive generosity not as a symptom of a wounded soul, but as an opportunity, a resource to be managed. No one understood this better than his manager, the man known as Colonel Tom Parker. The colonel saw Elvis's deep-seated need to provide, to be the generous king, and he recognized it for what it was, a powerful tool of control. Parker's contracts were legendary in their lopsidedness, often giving the colonel 50% of the gross income, an unheard-of figure. Any other artist would have rebelled, would have fought for a fairer share of the kingdom's treasury, but Elvis rarely did, because on a deep, psychological level, the arrangement made a terrible kind of sense. The colonel's insatiable financial appetite was just another mouth to feed, another gaping need that only he, Elvis the provider, could satisfy. Giving the colonel his 50% was just another grand gesture. It was another way of proving his worth, of keeping a powerful, father-like figure in his orbit. He was, in effect, buying the colonel's loyalty, just as he bought the loyalty of the Memphis Mafia. He was paying an exorbitant price to not be abandoned, a fear that had haunted him since the moment he was born alone. The more the colonel took, the more essential Elvis felt. This dynamic bled into his career. He was pushed into a relentless series of formulaic, forgettable Hollywood movies. They made money, vast sums of it, which was all that mattered to the colonel. For Elvis, the artist, they were soul-crushing, but they kept the machine running. They generated the revenue required to fund his pathological generosity. He was trapped on a treadmill, running faster and faster to earn the money he needed to give away, all to quiet a pain that no amount of money could ever truly touch. There were moments of escape. The 1968 comeback special, the triumphant return to live performance in Las Vegas, the Aloha from Hawaii concert, broadcast to over 1 billion people. In these moments, on stage, under the hot lights, he found a different kind of currency, the adoration of the crowd. It was pure, unconditional. They weren't his employees. He hadn't bought them Cadillacs. Their love was freely given, and for a few hours a night, it was enough. But then the show would end, the lights would go down, the applause would fade, and he would be left alone again, in the quiet of his suite, with the same ghosts that had followed him from that tiny shack in Tupelo. The silence would rush back in, louder than ever, and the only way he knew how to fight it was to reach for his checkbook, to call a jeweler in the middle of the night, to plan the next grand gesture. It was during these late Vegas years that the giving reached a fever pitch. He once gave the heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali a custom-designed $30,000 robe, emblazoned with the words, "The People's Champion, a gift from one king to another." But even this was not a simple act of friendship. It was a projection. Elvis, trapped by his own image, by the demands of his court and his manager, saw in Ali a freedom he had lost. By anointing Ali as the people's champion, he was vicariously touching a kind of authentic power he felt was slipping through his own fingers. His generosity was no longer just about vanquishing the past. It had become a desperate attempt to feel something real in a world that had become entirely artificial. A world he himself had built. He showered near strangers with jewels, cars, and cash, seeking in their shock and awe a reflection of his own power. A momentary confirmation that he still mattered, that he could still make a seismic impact on someone's life with a wave of his hand. He once met a bank manager in Washington, D.C., and, learning the man's wife was a fan, spent thousands of dollars on a custom-built Stutz Blackhawk car and had it delivered to her. He didn't know these people. He would never see them again. The act was entirely for himself. It was a performance, a one-act play of magnanimity staged to reassure an audience of one. The terrified boy still cowering inside him. The boy who was terrified that if he stopped giving, if the money ran out, everyone would leave. And the money was running out. Despite earning millions a year, his expenses were astronomical. The cost of maintaining his court, of servicing the colonel's percentage, and of funding his own compulsive spending was pushing him to the brink. The fortress was beginning to crumble. The pressure mounted, and with it, his paranoia grew. He started to see the strings attached to his own gifts. He began to question the very loyalty he had paid so dearly to secure. In a rare moment of bitter clarity, he turned on one of his closest aides after a minor disagreement. The argument wasn't about the issue at hand. It was about everything. About the years of dependency, the unspoken contracts, the suffocating weight of his own largesse. He looked at the man, a friend he had supported for over a decade, and the words came out like venom. "I could buy and sell you," he snarled. The friendship, in that moment, was stripped bare, revealed for the fragile, cash-based construct it had become. The words hung in the air, a confession of the ugly truth behind the beautiful myth. He wasn't a king bestowing gifts. He was a master reminding a servant of his place. And the realization was horrifying, most of all, to himself. And the realization was horrifying, most of all, to himself. But what if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if the money wasn't just a shield against loneliness? What if it was also a weapon? Not a weapon to hurt others, but a tool to bend reality to his will. To build a world where he was never powerless, never poor, never the boy whose twin died at birth. Graceland wasn't just a home. It was a laboratory, a human terrarium where every variable could be controlled by his checkbook. The people in his life became characters in a play he was writing in real time. The gifts weren't just gifts. They were costumes, props, stage directions. He wasn't just being generous. He was being a director. And in the final act of his life, his lead actress was a woman named Linda Thompson. He met the beauty queen in 1972, shortly after his separation from Priscilla. He was vulnerable, and she was a beacon of light and stability. He showered her with affection, and, of course, with gifts. But this was different. It was a complete and total acquisition. He wasn't just buying her a car. He was attempting to purchase her entire world. He had her entire wing of Graceland redecorated to his taste, without her knowledge, while she slept. He bought her a new wardrobe, discarding clothes he didn't like. He even paid for her family to have a new home, moving them closer, absorbing them into his orbit. On the surface, it was the ultimate fairy tale, a king lavishing his queen with treasures. But beneath the surface, a gilded cage was being constructed, bar by golden bar. His love was intertwined with a terrifying need for control. He was rebuilding his life after Priscilla left, and he was determined to make this new version indestructible, unfallible. Every gift to Linda was a rivet in the wall of this new fortress. Every diamond was a stone. He wasn't just saying, "I love you." He was saying, "You belong to me. Your world is my world. There is no reality outside the one I am creating for us." And that brings us to the ghost in the machine. Priscilla. Her departure was the one transaction he couldn't reverse. She was the one person his money failed to keep. He had given her everything, a home, fame, a lifestyle beyond imagination, and she had walked away from it all in search of her own identity. This wasn't just a heartbreak. It was a fundamental system failure. It proved that his greatest power had a limit. Her leaving invalidated his entire psychological defense mechanism. If you could have everything he could possibly give and still choose to leave, then what was the point of any of it? The shock of this echoed through every subsequent act of generosity. His spending became more frantic, more desperate. He was trying to patch a hole in his soul with $100 bills, trying to prove to himself that Priscilla was an anomaly, that everyone else had a price. But there was another, darker engine driving this manic behavior, a secret co-conspirator in his quest to control reality. His escalating prescription drug use. The connection between his compulsive spending and his chemical dependency is the missing piece of the puzzle. They weren't two separate problems. They were one single, terrifying feedback loop. He took uppers, amphetamines, to give him the energy to perform, to be Elvis. And in the amphetamine-fueled haze of late-night paranoia and grandiosity, the world seemed pliable, a thing to be molded. It was in these states that he'd make the midnight calls to jewelers, order a fleet of cars, plan a spontaneous trip to Vail for his entire entourage. The drugs told him he was a god, and his bank account was the tool he used to make it so. Then came the downers, the barbiturates and sleeping pills, to kill the artificial high, to quiet the racing thoughts, to bring on the oblivion of sleep. But in the morning, the crushing weight of reality would return, accompanied by a profound depression. A depression he would then combat with another grand gesture, another act of impossible generosity. The spending wasn't just to make others happy. It was a form of self-medication. The rush he got from seeing someone's face light up was as potent as any pill. And this is where the story turns truly tragic. Because Elvis began using his financial power not just to buy cars and jewelry, but to buy the very instruments of his own destruction. He found in Dr. George Nikopoulos, a physician willing to supply his needs. Dr. Nick would prescribe thousands upon thousands of doses of powerful, mind-altering narcotics for Elvis and his court. This wasn't healthcare. It was a supply chain. Elvis wasn't just a patient. He was Dr. Nick's benefactor. He bought the doctor a house, cars, paid for his investments. He showered him with cash and gifts. In essence, Elvis Presley put his own doctor on the payroll. He had found the ultimate enabler, and he was paying him handsomely for the privilege. The man who was terrified of being abandoned was now paying someone to stay and help him slowly disappear. Think about the horror of that. The boy who gave away his lunch at school because he couldn't stand to see another child go hungry had become a man who was using that same impulse to fund his own addiction. He was giving a man a fortune, not in exchange for loyalty, but for compliance. The generosity that had once been a shield against pain had metastasized. It had become the delivery system for the poison that would ultimately kill him. His world shrank. The trips to movie theaters and amusement parks in the middle of the night, the spontaneous flights to Denver for a specific type of sandwich. They weren't just the eccentricities of a rock star. They were frantic attempts to feel something, anything, real. He was a prisoner in his own kingdom, a king who had built the walls so high he could no longer see the outside world. There's a famous story from his final years. He decided, on a whim, in the middle of the night, that he wanted the lounge in his brand new racquetball court redecorated. Not next week, right now. He called in his people, his designers, his contractors, and they worked through the night, ripping out furniture, tearing down walls, spending a fortune to realize a fleeting, drug-fueled impulse. He sat there for hours, watching them work, a silent pharaoh overseeing the construction of a meaningless pyramid. This wasn't about interior design. It was about power. It was about proving, if only to himself, that the world still bent to his command, that with a single word, he could tear down reality and build it back up again in his own image, before the sun even rose. It was the desperate act of a man who had lost control of everything that mattered, trying to control the one thing he had left, his environment. The tragedy was, the one environment he couldn't redecorate was the one inside his own mind. But what if all the spending, all the gifts, all the frantic redecorating wasn't just about control? What if it was an attempt at construction? What if he was trying to build a replacement for the one thing he had lost that all the money in the world could never buy back? The death of his mother had left a void in him that was absolute. A fundamental pillar of his universe was gone. And so, in the wreckage, he began a new, desperate project. He would use his fortune as the foundation and build a new family from scratch. He found a young beauty queen, Linda Thompson, and didn't just fall in love with her. He tried to architect her. He showered her with a lifestyle beyond imagination. Furs, cars, houses, jewels. But it came with a script. He wanted her there. Always. He wanted her to look a certain way, to laugh at the right times, to fill the silence in the empty rooms of Graceland. He wasn't just looking for a partner. He was casting a role. The tragedy is, You can't buy a soul. You can't purchase genuine connection. Every gift became another gilded bar on her cage. And for Elvis, every moment she failed to live up to his impossible, drug-fueled fantasy was another crack in the facade, proving that he was, and always would be, utterly and completely alone. Because when all the money in the world can't buy you peace, what do you buy instead? He turned inward and downward into a labyrinth of spiritualism, mysticism, and the occult. He was hunting for an escape hatch from his own life, a secret password that would explain the pain. He collected spiritual gurus the way he collected cars, searching for a cosmic blueprint that could justify the emptiness he felt inside. But he wasn't looking for salvation. He was looking for permission. Permission to be this broken, this isolated, this lost. He wanted a grand cosmic reason for his suffering, because the simple human truth of it, that he was a lonely man, addicted to drugs, mourning a mother he lost 2 decades prior, was too mundane, too terrible to bear. The final tour was a procession of a king nearing his end. On stage, under the hot lights, something of the old magic would flicker. The voice, miraculously, was still a force of nature, a thunderous echo of the boy who had changed the world. But the body was failing. He was bloated, medicated, a prisoner in a rhinestone jumpsuit. The audience cheered for the legend, for the memory, while the man himself was fading away right in front of them, a slow-motion vanishing act performed for thousands every night. And then, the music stopped. On August 16, 1977, in the suffocating silence of an upstairs room in his Graceland palace, the boy from Tupelo's heart finally gave out. The kingdom he had built to keep the world out had become his tomb. The news broke like a sonic boom, a wave of collective disbelief and grief that circled the globe. The king was dead. It didn't seem possible. A force that powerful wasn't supposed to be mortal. In the end, what is the story of Elvis Presley? Is it the triumph of the American dream, or a cautionary tale of its excess? The answer is, it's both. He was a boy who sang from his soul because he had nothing else. He became a king who bought the world because his soul was no longer enough. He was a musical revolutionary and a tragic figure, a symbol of rebellion, who died in conformity to his own worst impulses. He was a supernova that burned so brightly it couldn't help but collapse in on itself. But the tragedy of his death does not get the final word. The man is gone, but the voice remains. It's still there, on the radio, in the static, a bolt of lightning captured on wax, the sound of a poor boy who, for a few brief, shining moments, made the entire world bend to the rhythm of his own heart. He wanted to be remembered, and he got his wish. He achieved a level of immortality that few have ever known, because Elvis Presley never really left the building. He is the building. The story of the man may have ended, but the legend is eternal. There are so many more doors to open, so many more songs to understand. To continue the journey and uncover the stories that built the myth, subscribe to Forever_Elvis_Stories.